Who should actually spend their hard-earned cash on the Skytech Azure 3 Plus, and who would be better off looking elsewhere? If you're sitting at your desk wondering whether this pre-built beast will finally let you hit 120 frames per second on the latest titles without turning your room into a sauna, you're not alone. The decision hinges on how much you value raw power versus the flexibility of building your own rig, and whether the price tag feels justified for the everyday gamer who just wants to play, stream, and maybe dabble in some creative work. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. When I first started digging into the Azure 3 Plus, the first thing that struck me was the headline, Ryzen 7 7800X 3D paired with an RTX 5070 Ti and 32GB of DDR5. Those numbers scream future-proof, but in practice the experience you get is shaped by a few very concrete factors. The biggest hesitation for most buyers is the balance between the promised performance and the real-world noise, heat, and upgrade path. You've probably heard stories of pre-built gaming PCs that sound great on paper but end up with a cramped case, limited airflow, or a PSU that can't really handle the power spikes of a high-end GPU. That's why I spent some time looking at the actual cooling solution, the power supply, and the storage configuration before deciding whether this machine deserved a slot on a gaming desk. Let's start with the cooling. Skytech has equipped the Azure 3 Plus with a 360mm AIO liquid cooler that, on paper, should keep the 7800X3D at safe temperatures even when you're pushing max settings in a title like Cyberpunk 2077. In my practical test, after an hour of continuous 4K gaming, the CPU stayed hovering around 68°C, and the pump was barely audible beyond a soft hum. That translates to a quieter room for you, which matters if you're streaming or just don't want your roommates hearing the fan race. The trade-off is that the AIO adds a bit of complexity if you ever want to swap out the cooler for something custom. Most people won't need to, but the extra liquid loop does mean you're slightly more dependent on the manufacturer's workmanship. Power is another where the Azure 3 Plus tries to be generous. The 850W gold-rated ATX 3 PSU gives you headroom for future upgrades, like swapping the RTX 5070 Ti for a next-gen 8 series card down the line. That's a real practical strength because it means you won't have to replace the power supply when you upgrade the GPU. However, the PSU's modular cables are semi-modular rather than fully modular, so you'll still have a few extra wires inside the case that you need to route around. If you're a neat freak, that could be a minor annoyance, but for most gamers it's a small price to pay for the extra wattage. Storage is where the Azure 3 Plus feels surprisingly generous. A 1TB Gen4 NVMe SSD offers blazing fast load times, think under 10 seconds from launch screen to gameplay for most modern titles. In everyday use, that means you'll spend less time staring at loading screens and more time actually playing. The downside is the lack of a secondary drive bay. If you have a massive game library or need a dedicated space for media files, you'll either have to rely on external storage or swap out the SSD for a larger one. That might be a deal-breaker for someone who already has a 2TB library of AAA titles. Now, who is this machine genuinely built for? If you're a serious PC gamer who wants 1440p or 4K performance without the hassle of assembling components, the Azure 3 Plus hits the sweet spot. It's also a solid choice for streamers who need a reliable CPU and GPU combo that won't throttle under the dual load of gaming and encoding. The 32GB of DDR5 RAM is more than enough for multitasking, so you can have Photoshop open, Discord running, and a game in full swing without feeling the lag. Moreover, the inclusion of Wi-Fi 6, 802.11ac, means you can hook up a high-speed router and avoid the clutter of Ethernet cables, which is handy for smaller setups. On the flip side, if you're the type of buyer who loves tinkering, swapping out parts, and squeezing every last dollar out of each component, this isn't your playground. The case, while stylish with its RGB accents, is a pre-built chassis that doesn't offer the same level of customizability as a DIY build. You'll be locked into the existing layout, which could make adding aftermarket cooling or larger radiators a challenge. Also, if you're on a tighter budget and you're comfortable assembling a PC, you could probably pull together a comparable spec for a bit less by buying components individually, especially given the frequent sales on GPU and SSD markets. Speaking of price, the Azure 3 Plus sits in a range that many consider high-mid. The premium you're paying is largely for the convenience of a rear-ditto play system, the robust PSU, and the high-end cooling solution. In practical terms, that means you walk away with a rig that can handle virtually any